You're born somewhere in Europe. It's anywhere between the 9th and 15th century. As you were growing up, knights were seen as warriors and role models, and most of the time there were two main reasons why kids became knights. One was because you were born into a somewhat wealthy family. Maybe your dad was also a knight, so you had to live up to the family name. Or you weren't as wealthy, so your parents sent you away to become a knight in exchange for land and protection. I guess your parents didn't love you as much as you thought. Basically, young knights were sent away and trained to fight for their lord in any war. This allowed nobles to maintain a powerful military force, while knights and their families gained status and a good living. These kids were usually sent to a noble household. If you were lucky, it could have been a massive castle, at around the age of 7, and immediately began training to become a knight. But you first were given the title of a page. Pages would act as a personal assistant, running errands, serving meals, and cleaning armor. You kind of were in charge of the bitch work. Your training was mainly learning knight tactics, how to use your weapons, and somehow learn how to ride this massive horse. But more on that later. You also learned etiquette, reading, and writing skills that were not taught to the lower classes of people back then, but the training was far from easy. Knights were famous for close-up hand-to-hand combat with huge 40 to 70-pound plates of armor covering them, so you better get pretty good with these weapons or you're probably gonna die. And if you made any mistakes during your training, it wasn't unusual to get beat up by an older knight. There were a handful of weapons you were training with. Some were swords, crossbows, daggers, axes, and of course learning how to use a shield. You even gave your best shot at riding that massive horse I was talking about at only 7 years old. And I mean, these things were big. I'm talking like if one foot steps on you by accident, you're done. But nonetheless, you gave it your best shot. And even though you fell down, you got back up and tried again and then fell down again. And while you're dealing with all that, you also have to remember that you were separated from your family and your home. Living with strangers meant that you had to constantly prove yourself worthy of being a future knight, with tons of other kids also trying to do the same thing, because not everyone would actually become a knight. You would be busy doing everyone's dirty work and some training for about 7 years, and by the time you turned 14, you would typically be promoted from a page to a squire. Your training got even more intense. You began to really learn how to use these weapons, and oh look, the horse is back, and somehow he looks even bigger than before. You learned a little more of what it took to be able to control these things on the battlefield, but I already told you how massive these things were, so I'm not too sure how you're supposed to ride them. Squires were also responsible for taking care of the knight's armor and weapons, and were often given a lot more chores and responsibilities. Being a squire allowed you to learn firsthand what it was like to be a knight, and sometimes you were even asked to fight alongside knights in actual battles. At only 14, you were constantly exposed to the dangers of battle and warfare, seeing firsthand how brutal war really was. Like I said before, squires also learned how to fight and defend in battle, but sometimes you wouldn't even have protection of full armor or weapons. Imagine fighting grown men with armor and weapons, and all you have is this stick. Yeah, probably not gonna go too well, and many squires died young because of this, even before becoming a knight. Even though you didn't feel important, you were important. You had to make sure all the armor was perfect and the weapons were sharpened, and any defect meant life or death. Plus, if a knight was hurt in battle, it was your job to drag him to safety. By the time you reached the age of 21, you now had a chance to become a knight. Congratulations! All you had to do was train for 14 years, and now you have this cool sword and some land. Oh, and now you get 70 pounds of armor to wear around most of your day. Oh, look, the horse is back again, and somehow he keeps getting bigger! Now that you're a knight, you go straight to the front lines. The heavy armor you're wearing restricted mobility and could make even simple actions exhausting. Not to mention it was almost impossible to see out of. Like I said, the main weapons you used were swords, maces, crossbows, daggers, and anything else you could use up close. But of course, what knights were most known for was riding horseback and using lances, or the super long sword thingy they would carry while on the horse. One of the main reasons they rode horseback was that a knight on horseback could move faster than foot soldiers, letting them charge into battle and pursue fleeing enemies. Speed was one of the most important pieces of war back then. Riding a horse also allowed knights to be taller than whoever they were fighting. The height made it easier for knights to swing swords, spears, or lances over the heads of foot soldiers. Plus, the long reach of a knight's lance or sword was way more effective from horseback. Your heavy armor and overpowered horse combined to deliver devastating blows. Any normal person on the floor stood no chance, and gaining an advantage wasn't the only reason knights rode horseback. Another was for social status. Horses were expensive to maintain, and only those with wealth could afford to own and care for them. A horse back then was basically like a Lamborghini today, so even though you might be dying soon, at least you looked cool for the ladies. By the time you actually go to war, it isn't all it's cracked out to be like you thought it was as a kid. The extremely high risk of being wounded or killed in battle was always in the back of your mind, and wars during the medieval times were long, brutal, and exhausting. The average knight had to go months of being away from home, living in harsh conditions with terrible food, poor sanitation, and the constant threat of dying. There was almost no food, if any. At the best, you had some salted meat, hard bread, or whatever you could find on the ground. Not to mention, most of the time you were just sleeping on the floor with maybe a blanket if you were lucky. And if you were even thinking about leaving, well, it was already too late. To become a knight, you took an oath to follow the Code of Chivalry, which included pledges such as, "I will be loyal to my lord and king, and will defend the weak." So sorry, there was no leaving anytime soon for you. You were kept busy all day trying to conquer castles, raid villages, and fight on the front lines in long, bloody battles. If you somehow had some free time, you might even just charge at your friend on a horse with a long lance to pass the time. Even with all the heavy armor, knights were not exactly bulletproof. Arrows, sword strikes, and lances could penetrate weak spots in armor. Many knights suffered serious injuries such as broken bones, concussions, or deep cuts, and even though there were doctors back during this time, it wasn't exactly modern medicine, so that meant even non-serious injuries could often lead to infections and, in many cases, slow and painful death. And even if you survived all that, the long-lasting injuries could not only affect your ability to fight again, but even just live the rest of your life comfortably. Like, imagine if you break a bone or tear your ACL back then. There wasn't really a lot you could do, so they might just have to put you down behind the barn like an old horse. Let's say you somehow managed to survive long enough to become a knight, and even longer to stay alive after becoming one. Many knights died young, often in their 30s or 40s at best, due to the dangerous nature of the profession, so your chances weren't great. If you weren't already dealing with injuries, the trauma of warfare would have tons of psychological effects on you. Medieval combat usually meant that knights faced close, personal encounters with their enemies. The violence and bloodshed on the battlefield could have long-lasting psychological effects, including post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which added to the list of problems knights faced after retiring. You know, if they made it that far. But, unfortunately for you, you were born a knight, so, good luck.